and we'll get a picture of us, okay? Don't forget that. And now it's my great pleasure to have Professor Anton Souslov here. I've known Anton for many years, since he was a graduate student in Tom Lubensky's group at Penn, where he did his PhD. And then he went on to a postdoc in Georgia Tech, and then at Leiden and Chicago, and now he's a professor at the University of Cambridge. Thank you so much for coming, Anton, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, and it's great to see lots of familiar faces and meet lots of people I haven't met before. It's my first time in Sao Paulo, so I've been very much enjoying your winter weather here. My talk will be on active matter, and sort of before I begin with anything, I wanted to ask, how many of you have heard the term active matter? And how many of you are currently working or doing research around some active matter topics? So quite a few of you. So my talk will probably be not aimed at the active matter researchers, but maybe as the talk goes on, I hope that there will be some things that you can take away from it. I think today especially I wanted to focus on the very basic kind of background ideas behind active matter, and since most active matter research has been focused on fluids over the years, I'm going to spend quite a bit on fluids this lecture, and then move on to active solids later on. So to begin, I kind of wanted to give my own maybe version of what I think of active matter and why I think it's interesting. To do that, I'm going to start with what is now maybe a classic video from 15 years ago. And it's a fairly simple video. All you see is this gear, this cogwheel, that's placed in some sort of a bath. And so this is a fluid here, but it's not a typical fluid. It's a fluid of bacteria, which is an example of active matter. And what's special about this video is that the cogwheel begins to rotate in a single direction. There's no net kind of rotational flow in the background fluid. Instead, there's lots of fluctuations. And if these were equilibrium fluctuations, if the bacteria obeyed the rules of equilibrium statistical mechanics, then detailed balance would tell you that the gear would rotate clockwise and counterclockwise with equal probability, right? It would fluctuate around a certain configuration. Instead, what you see is a net rotation on the gear, which in this sort of overdamped system, in a system where there's no inertia for the gear to rotate in the same direction, means that this rotation comes from a net torque that the bacterial fluid exerts on the gear. Right? And the fact that a fluid can exert a net torque on a passive object that's placed inside it is something that's atypical and requires some new physics to understand it relative to what we usually think of in fluid dynamics. Right? So I would say that's kind of one of the approaches I will take with these lectures is thinking about what we expect to happen, right, in a particular experiment, in a particular system, and thinking about how active matter can do something different, right? It doesn't, some people say, oh, this clearly breaks the laws of statistical mechanics. I'll be maybe a little bit more cautious than saying that because, of course, the laws of statistical mechanics apply very well to an equilibrium system. It's just that this is not one of those cases. The other thing that's sort of special here is that, and that's common to active matter, that maybe makes it a particular class of systems out of equilibrium, is that the bacteria themselves are much smaller than the gear. So to give you kind of experimental length scales, the gear is sub-millimeter, right, just under a millimeter across. The bacteria are sub-micron, right? So there's a very large separation of scales between the large-scale phenomena that we're interested in, sort of fluid scale phenomena, and the particle scale phenomena where the interesting kind of non-equilibrium things happen, right? The bacteria eat, right? They consume nutrients, then they swim, and that's what happens at the scale of a single particle, but at the collective scale, you have these interesting fluctuations that result in something like a net torque. Right? And this is just one of the examples, right, of how what kind of things can happen and what sort of constituents, right, the system can be made from. So one sort of very general definition of active matter that I've presented here is that there's energy being consumed at the microscale. In this video, that was the bacteria scale. And this leads to emergent phenomena, to interesting physics at the macro scale. And as I said, the emergent phenomena that I want to focus on are those that are somehow surprising or counterintuitive. Right? So there's a lot within that we could try to play around with, right? What sort of scale is the micro scale? How is the energy consumed, and what does it lead to, right? So I mentioned there's a net torque or a net work being done on the object in this video, and what kind of macro scale and emergent phenomena we're looking at. Another example that I'll come back to when we talk about it in some more details is this example of a different flowed fluid. So this is the bacteria themselves were living systems. This is maybe somewhere between a living and a synthetic system. It's sort of a system developed by the Dogic lab in also more than 10 years ago now. This is a system of biofilaments and molecular motors. And so what happens if you take these two molecules, they're found in, the filaments are called microtubules, and the motors are called kinesin, and they're present in pretty much all living things, right? You take some sort of a living cell, and you isolate these two components and you add energy to the mix, right? It's essentially a mix of motors. So these are one kind of protein, right? These filaments, a different kind of protein, and ATP, which is where the energy comes from. That's the fuel, right? And what happens, again, is counterintuitive in the sense that there's no kind of imposed flow in the video here, right? This isn't, turbulence and pipe flow or anything like that. Instead, the fluid begins to flow spontaneously, and not only does it flow spontaneously, but it begins to form these patterns, right? That you see here, these swirls. You see kind of clumps of various densities on these filaments, right? And there's lots of physical questions here that that can be quantified experimentally, that have been quantified experimentally, and that can be explained through theory, right? Theory both in terms of what happens at the microscale, which is sort of how the motors exert forces, right, on these filaments, and then the emergent phenomena when we talk about many motors and many filaments together, how they interact. And so this is an example of a pattern-forming system. Another system that's perhaps simpler in several different ways is a purely synthetic one, right? And maybe one of the themes of the lectures that I wanted to go through is the idea of using kind of bio-inspiration, using things that can be observed in nature, and making synthetic systems that are perhaps simpler or easier to control based on those physics, based on the physics that happens in biology. And so this example comes from the Bartolo lab. And what you see here might look like it's alive in the sense, right? There's this herd of particles that's flowing in one direction. But actually, this is a purely synthetic system, and all these particles are plastic spheres that have been put into water, right, or a solution, I should say. And there's an effect here, the physical chemistry effect called the Quincke rotation that happens. Won't go too much into the details, right? These are the sort of microscopic details for why the particles self-propel. But essentially what's happening here is that there's a current that's flowing out of the board due to an applied electric field, right? This current is what breaks the conditions of equilibrium. Sort of supplies fuel to these particles, and the particles begin to rotate around an axis within this plane, right, due to this external current. And so if the particles were kind of in bulk 3D solutions and they began to rotate, you wouldn't be able to see it, but in this case, they're placed near a substrate and they begin to roll on the substrate, right? So this kind of self-propulsion is due to kind of a rolling, you know, a wheel that rolls itself. I don't think so, because they're fairly spherical in this case. You can measure it, and you know, in various different ways. So one thing that people have done is make little pear-shaped or non-spherical particles, and then you can really see that they go in along the axis around which they can rotate. All right, so at the level of a single particle, you get what's called a self-propelled particle, and I'll come back to what that means, which is essentially just if you track one of these spheres, especially in the dilute state, kind of before this herd comes along, it just goes in one direction persistently for quite a while. It once in a while hits other particles or interacts with other particles and changes its orientation as a result. But you can think of this as kind of a gas state. The more surprising, more interesting thing that happens is at higher densities here in this flock. And what's happening there is that when a particle starts to roll, if it has neighbors, those neighbors will begin to reorient with the rolling of the particles. And there's kind of two main effects that are responsible for it. One is a purely sort of electrostatic effect due to the polarizations here. Another effect that's important, that's maybe a little bit easier to understand, is the fact that a particle, when it's self-propelling, drags fluid along with it, right? So there's a flow that it creates. And so the particles, its neighbors, feel this flow. And so they naturally reorient to go with the flow, right, to flow along with it. And so then the particles begin to all start moving in the same direction until you get this macroscopic state, right, of spontaneous flow. And the fact that it's reminiscent of a herd of animals or a flock of birds also suggests that, first of all, there's some maybe connections with biology with this phenomenon, but then that the microscopic details, the fact that this has this Quincke roller effect is not so important. What's important is kind of how you get from the microscopics to the emergent length scale, right, to the macro length scale. So these are kind of the three typical examples, some of the typical examples of active fluids, right, where you have flow-like phenomena that emerge due to this consumption of energy. And that's what I'll focus on today, but to give you kind of a broader picture of the rest of these lectures is that where I want to get to is active solids, right, and thinking about emergent phenomena that are elastic or solid-like. And there are, again, a few kind of typical examples of those. A lot of them are maybe more recent, but one classic video that I like is this idea of a self-folding origami sheet. And in this case, what you're seeing is a sheet of plastic with some folds kind of made into it. And what's special about it is the fact that these folds have actuators attached to them. So these are little motors you could think of that exert forces, that exert torques on these folds. And these folds are programmed in this way. And this is not an emergent phenomenon, but instead a pre-programmed one, where the order of the folds and how which folds fold which way determines the final shape of the object. And you might be able to see that the final shape is that of a boat, a little origami boat that you can make from a sheet of paper. right? The special thing here is that, of course, you don't need someone to fold this piece of paper, and the kind of places where this is useful technologically is unfolding satellites in space or deployable structures in things like desert where you don't want a human to have to go and do the origami unfolding. You want it to happen spontaneously, right? But again, as physicists, sort of the programmed states are perhaps less surprising, right? They were kind of put there by hand. What's to me more surprising is when interesting things emerge from a combination of active components and elasticity, right? Things that perhaps were not expected, right? And one example of this that I like is from the Doshot lab, where they put little self-propelled particles. These are robots. They're much larger than the other self-propelled particles and the colloids that I mentioned. They're kind of a couple of centimeters in size. And here the special thing about them is that they're not self-propelled particles on a substrate, kind of free to roam, but instead each of these particles is caged in its own little cage, right? So here, if you look at this, you have the self-propelled robot in this black ellipse shape, right? And the little cage around it, you can see, and it stays within that. And so if you had a bunch of these cages, the particles would just roam around within them, right? They would be confined. And a natural kind of thing for a self-propelled particle to do is to kind of go around the edge of the boundary, right? Much like the termites that we saw yesterday. What's special here, though, is that these self-propelled particles can communicate with each other, and they communicate with each other purely through physical elasticity, right? So these cages are then connected with these elastic filaments, and you can see that a cage can push on its neighbors, right? And it's sort of all arranged in a lattice. By the way, these robots, just to tell you what they are, they're called hex bugs, and they're little kind of vibrating motors on top of an elastic kind of sheet. You can think of this as a toothbrush, right? An electric toothbrush that's been sort of set on a table with a little tilt in the bristles so that it goes in one direction. And so what you're seeing here is due to the combination of activity, right, which gives it kind of some sort of interesting dynamics going on here, and the elastic interactions, which leads to kind of a macroscopic state. You have this overall dynamical state where every particle, first of all, is synchronized, right? What you can see is that they're all rotating in the same direction. Right? And they deform the lattice in some sort of way that we can try to understand, right? And some sort of macroscopic kind of swirling-like motion. And so this is one of the synthetic examples, a synthetic active solid example, but one of the reasons I like this as an example of an active solid is that just a year after this original paper was published, there was a paper on a completely different system, a bacterial system called a bacterial biofilm that does pretty much the same thing, right? As a sort of physicist model, minimal model of this bacterial system is more or less the same as the robot system. So here you can't see the individual bacteria, and I should tell you exactly what's happening. So what you do see is the same kind of mode, the global rotational mode, being activated in this active solid. And the reason that it's a solid is that this is an example of a bacterial biofilm where the bacteria, when they're stressed, try to create an elastic matrix around them. They make some polymer that has some elastic properties, right? And that protects them from the harsh environment outside. And what's happening here is that they've made some of this biofilm, some of this elastic polymer, but not so much as to arrest them. Eventually, this will all kind of stop because the bacteria, the elasticity will win, right? They'll be essentially embedded in a purely rigid matrix. But in this kind of early stage of biofilm formation, you have this interplay between activity, which is here the motion of the bacteria, right? that act as self-propelled particles, and the elasticity where they can deform their own environment and use that to communicate with their neighbors, right, to get this sort of macroscopic state. So again, in this kind of active-solid context, we have the interplay between elasticity and activity, and we can take some of the tools from biology to understand synthetic systems and vice versa. Another sort of biological or maybe biophysical system that I'll talk about tomorrow, that's maybe more of the focus of the lecture tomorrow, is this one, which is a much larger scale than the bacterial biofilm. And you see here that this is almost a macro scale. You can see this crystallite by eye. And what you're seeing here is, again, an active solid. So you can see by eye is the fact that it's solid in the sense that these atoms, and I'll tell you about what these atoms are, make a fairly good crystalline lattice, hexagonal lattice, over a fairly large area. There's hundreds of particles here, so we can really start to think about the emergent phenomena. And the reason that it's active is because these atoms aren't atoms at all. They're, in fact, organisms kind of in the early stages of their development. In particular, they're starfish that are embryos that are developing here. So they're not yet starfish shaped, which is why they're around here. But they are active in the sense that they're alive. And the way that they're active here is fairly simple, which is that the individual particle, here the individual embryo, goes to this air-water interface where it's being filmed, right? This is where the movie is taking place. And it begins to rotate around its own axis at this interface due to the swimming mechanism that it has. Essentially, the way that it would swim if it were in 3D water would be to rotate some filaments on its end, here, because it's stuck at the interface, it can't use that rotation to swim, but it will just naturally start to rotate in place.
Anton,
yeah,
just quick here. Is there reproduction there, or is there reproduction, or?
No, there's no, yeah. So the reason that it's growing is not due to reproduction. They're all I think what's kind of important in this experiment, which is what makes it a physics experiment, is that they're all the same age, right? Which kind of makes it easier to crystallize. You could imagine that all the particles are the same. So instead, they're kind of all made at the same time and made to evolve. It just so happens, right? But again, what's physically very convenient here is that there is this certain development time, the certain age of these embryos, where they, for some biological reasons, tend to go to this air-water interface. And I think that's not so well known. People can speculate why they might want to, clump together at a surface. Maybe it's for protection and so on. But for me, at least, this is just a physical phenomenon that's been observed that's convenient for forming these crystallites. All right, so you have this crystal, right? You can, I hope you're with me that it really is crystalline. And, but the special thing about the crystal is that every particle is rotating within the crystal, right? And we can ask, well, does that change the properties of the crystal? In particular, what I'll talk about throughout these lectures is the mechanical properties of both fluids and solids. And so you can ask, what kind of mechanical properties does this crystal have? And of course, it turns out that there's lots of interesting mechanical properties here that we'll get to. But what I wanted to emphasize here is that there's a set of these mechanical properties that's actually completely independent of the microscopics, of the fact that these are starfish embryos, or even of the fact that they're rotating on a surface. And in particular, this is a concept that I'll...
Can I ask a question?
Please.
They are on the active matter itself are the embryos, not the fluid in which they are, right? Yeah,
the fluid is just water with
inert,
some nutrient.
Okay, so the rotation comes from the fact that they are active.
Yeah,
okay.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. They sort of have the ATP within them that makes them rotate.
But there's some specific conditions where this cluster flock and move together, or just rotate.
So in this case, they're self-rotating particles, so they have no self-propulsion within the surface, right? So that system won't flock, in fact, unlike the colloidal example or the bacterial examples that I've given.
The process involves the alignment, some specific alignment between particles, self-alignment or whatever.
So there's, in a sense, an alignment here, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's a spontaneous alignment. They're always kind of pointing upwards, right? So you have this interface, this air-water interface, and they always point up around this interface. And again, the reason for this, you can kind of describe it in terms of fluid dynamics, if you know the flow around an embryo, and that was done in this paper in quite a bit of detail, but why they do this biologically, why they want to be aligned all perpendicular to a surface, I think that's not well known. So you can kind of take it as a given. That's just what these organisms do. And that's maybe another theme of active matter, of biological active matter, that you often don't have very much control over what these things do, right? They kind of do something in nature, and maybe you can, feed them more or feed them less, right? And see how that change their activity somewhat. But the advantages of a lot of the synthetic systems that I'll talk about is the fact that you can do, lots of other things to them. You can tweak every parameter in some sort of way and see how that changes things.
When these starfish embryos mate, do you know if there is some sort of adhesion between them? Like they adhere permanently?
That's a very good question. There's a purely physical kind of, it's not adhesion, but attraction between them. Maybe I'll draw something that will help here. So the way that it looks kind of from the side rather than from the top is that you have this, remember, it's kind of slightly elongated, right, rotating around this axis, right? And then you have another one here rotating in the same direction and so on, right? But they're not just rotating. What's happening instead is that they are expelling water, right? As they're rotating, they kind of create this sort of flow around them, right? In here. And this flow has a component that's horizontal, right? So the flow due to this particle, that this particle feels is attractive, right? Is towards its neighbor.
It's more like attraction rather than adhesion, right? In
Yeah,
the sense
exactly.
of tissue cells which can adhere to form a tissue.
Yeah.
You don't have
This doesn't do that, yeah.
Do you know more or less the range of this attraction? Is it a few particle sizes?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, it's hydrodynamic, so it's power law, but it's a fairly large power law, so it's fairly short range. All right. Well, I wanted to say that this kind of emergent mechanics that you have in the starfish embryo system has also been measured experimentally in other systems that seem to be completely different than starfish embryos, right? So one of these, the one that's maybe more similar that I wanted to show you is this system of colloidal particles, right? And the similarity here is that these are also rotating colloidal particles. The length scale here is very different, right? Where now each particle is around a micron in size. So by the way, the embryos were from the Fakhri lab at MIT. These are from the Irvin lab in Chicago. And so these colloidal particles are, what's special about them is that they are magnetic colloids. So they have a magnetic dipole on each of them, right? And the way that they're activated, the way they're made active is that there's an external magnetic field now that's being applied. And this magnetic field is in the plane here. Right? And then once that's set up, the magnetic field rotates in the plane. And each of the particles follows the rotation of this magnetic field, right? So as a result, you get, again, a two-dimensional system where each particle is rotating. There's now, in addition to hydrodynamic interactions, things like steric interactions, right? These colloids running into each other, and magnetic interactions, right, between the dipoles, and they are also important here. But the effect is that you also have the formation of crystallites, and the way you can see it here, what's shown in color is the local crystalline order, right? To what degree is the local configuration like a crystal or like a fluid? So these lighter patches are crystallites, which again are sizable here. You see some interesting dynamics going on with the crystallites rearranging and swirling, and that's a really interesting aspect of the system. But another aspect that's important here is the mechanics of these individual crystallites, which again have been experimentally shown to have the same mechanics, the same linear elasticity as the starfish embryo system. And perhaps that's surprising because they have little to do with each other.
Yeah, I'm wondering why are you calling this an active system? Because you say you have a colloidal particle which is not active by itself, and then you excite by something which is external.
Yeah.
And then each of them, they take energy from this external field, right? Is it different from a spin with magnetization? I mean.
Yeah. So this is an important kind of distinction. So I would say that there are systems that are maybe more clearly active and less clearly active, right? And in fact, both of the colloidal systems that are presented, these ones on the rollers, right, rely on an external field. So you might think that, well, does that make them active in the sense that does it really consume energy at the microscale at that point, right? But here, because the field only couples to the degrees of freedom of a single particle, right, and all the emergent behavior you see is, first of all, the time scales that are much longer than the period of rotation. I mean, you can see rotations here being quite fast. But also at a length scale that's not due to, say, variations on the magnetic field, but really due to the interactions between the particles. I say that there are at least active phenomena in here, phenomena that aren't explicitly put in by the external field. And the same thing with the rollers, right? While the field in the case of roll powers your system, it really powers it at an individual particle scale, and then everything we're observing is a much larger scale. But I agree that this is perhaps something to say, that there is, I would say, maybe a continuum of systems that are purely self-contained. Like organisms tend to be purely self-contained. I mean, you have to feed them once in a while. Even organisms run out of energy. To systems that require an external field, to systems that are actually driven, right? If you think about, well, what's the simplest out of equilibrium system I can make, to have two thermal baths, right? Or have a fluid and an external flow, right? That's not an active system because the energy being injected is at the largest length scales instead, and that's clearly just a driven out of equilibrium system. And so finally, of these three examples of odd elasticity, of active elasticity that I wanted to get to, I wanted to show you this one, which doesn't spin, right? It doesn't rely on spinning particles at all. They are active, right, in the sense that these are very, very literally motors, right? They are linear actuators, and they've been programmed in a certain way. We can talk about how they've been programmed. But the important thing here is that if you measure the large-scale elasticity of this system, it will have the same character, the same active parameters that describe the embryos and the colloids, even though it's not based on spinning, even though the length scale for the individual components, which is a couple of centimeters, is much larger. Right?
There's nothing persistent in a sense that the direction is always the same, right? Yeah.
Here, in terms of the chirality here. So there is a chirality in the system. The chirality, you can't quite see it, but it's programmed in how these motors interact with each other, right? And I'll talk about, maybe even in the third lecture, I'll talk about the kind of dynamics that we might expect from a system like this. This was done, experiments were done in the Kooley lab in Amsterdam. But for now, I just wanted to point out that what you can do is you can take the interaction, somehow the interactions that you know from the starfish embryo system or the colloidal system and program them into an active system that doesn't look like colloids or embryos in any way, shape, or form. All right. And so this kind of brings me to another important point, another important theme in my lectures, which is that you can, if you look at the largest length scales, if you look at things like elasticity or fluid dynamics in these active systems, often you can find connections. Oh, yeah.
Hi, sorry. So do you see a recurrent pattern between chiral symmetry breaking and activity emergent phenomena? Because like from the start, from the gear to the last system you showed us, or not all of the systems, but I think most of them had this chiral symmetry breaking, right?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. I would say that chirality is going to be a really important theme, right? It's both kind of a way to, one of the symmetries that can be used to characterize active matter, right? An important symmetry, and then that symmetry can be, not broken spontaneously or broken explicitly, right? And those will all be kind of, have interesting phenomena resulting from it. So I'll certainly talk about chirality quite a bit throughout. Thank you for the question. What I wanted to say is that when we look at the largest length scales, often the microscopic details of the active system don't matter in the same way that molecular interactions don't matter when you're thinking about the large-scale fluid flow. Say the air in this room, all they do is give you some sort of parameter values to describe the fluid, the air, or the water. And same with solids, right? For structural mechanics, you get moduli out from the molecular interactions, but you don't need to worry about the details of the interactions to describe the large-scale system. And that's going to be kind of my philosophical take on active matter, that you can do that at least in some cases. We know you can do that to great success, to kind of quantitatively understand the behavior of active systems. And so these are kind of some of the questions that I wanted to get back to throughout these lectures, and maybe some of the themes that we can kind of reflect on together. So, I wanted to ask them now so that we can kind of keep thinking about them as we go through different examples. So the first one is, one thing we could try to do is to describe and classify different active systems based on symmetries and conservation laws. And again, the power of that is that we can make then contact between different systems, so we can ask what features of active matter are somehow universal, right? Somehow are independent of the microscopic detail, and are rather, consequences of these, maybe more general ideas like symmetries and conservation laws. And finally, maybe a broader question I wanted to ask is, how do and other tools that we use in theoretical physics, especially like topology and non-reciprocity, come into active matter? And I won't talk so much about these today, but more so tomorrow or next lecture. All right, so this was kind of the very first part, the introduction. I wanted to give you kind of an overview of where I would like these lectures to go. I'll talk about kind of a very broad classification of active fluids that doesn't necessarily have every single example in it, but most examples fall either into polar, scalar, pneumatic, and chiral active fluids, and within that, you can also classify them by through other means. Tomorrow's lecture will be on active solids, and I'll also introduce topology as a sort of useful tool to think about active matter, both in the fluids and the solid context. And I'll introduce this idea of autoelasticity and try to explain some of the phenomena observed in these active solid, active crystalline systems. And then in the third lecture, I wanted to tell you actually about some of the research we're doing currently on this topic in terms of things like percolation transitions, design principles, pattern formation, locomotion, and various examples of active solids. I'll try to, I'll try to make sure that things are referenced as they come up on the slides, but these are very broad references that touch on a lot of the same themes and topics that I'll talk about. So this has a focus on topology, this one on odd viscosity and odd elasticity, this one on hydrodynamics and active fluids, and these are kind of more broad condensed matter and topological textbook and a review. All right. So with this kind of introduction, let me actually get to the classification of active fluids. And in particular, I wanted to specify now some of these questions that I asked to the fluid context, right? So in hydrodynamics, one of the things that I wanted to say to begin with, to avoid any sort of confusion, is that when I'm talking about active hydrodynamics, I'm not so worried about the effect of this fluid, right? If I look at this picture here, right, the fluid that's surrounding the embryos, rather I'm interested in the emergent behavior when we think of the active particles themselves as forming a fluid, right? So it's like kind of the relevant degrees of freedom for us are the, the centers of mass of the active particles, right? Their positions and so on. Instead, the fluid can be important, the surrounding fluid can be important, but it'll be important through the kind of effective interactions between the active particles that it can bring, right? And sometimes that's important, sometimes not. So that's what I mean by hydrodynamic interactions. It's, the rest of the fluid. The reason that we're in particular interested in writing out hydrodynamics is sort of by analogy with equilibrium systems where large length scales and slow time scales are described by continuum equations, by the Navier-Stokes equations. So what we're interested in are the analogs, the similar kind of equations that we have, but now for collections of active particles. And it turns out that one of the reasons to talk about this approach is that it's been fairly successful, right? That there's based on these symmetries and conservation laws, there's lots of experimental systems that we know are well described by these hydrodynamic models at large length scales. So looking sort of at our review, there's this particular table that we made that I thought was a very useful introduction to sort of this symmetry-based approach. And so this table has the different kinds of systems, again, not an exhaustive list, but a very broad ones, along with kind of typical models used to describe them. So what I wanted to do now is to go through this table one by one, and to sort of introduce all of these systems. Right? So to start with, I'll talk about polar active polar fluids. Right? And this is already the example that I gave you. This is the same video of these colloidal rollers that I showed, which flock. And the special thing about flock is the fact that there's an arrow that you can define to each particle, and the particles kind of line their arrows, right? So you have a polar order, which is where the name of a polar fluid comes from. So there's an associated model for polar fluids. This is kind of a particularly simple version of it. There can be other terms that you can describe, but what I wanted to bring up here is the fact that this model is reminiscent of the equilibrium version of fluid hydrodynamics, which is the Navier-Stokes equation. So I wanted to ask kind of how many of you are familiar with the Navier-Stokes equations? Would you be able to write it down? Yeah, most of you. So maybe I'll just then briefly write them out in the same, in a similar notation, just so we can compare and contrast these two cases, right? So the first equation is, in fact, identical. This is called the continuity equation. And in both cases, right, in the case of a polar active fluid and a case of equilibrium fluid, this is going to be equilibrium. It's a consequence of the conservation of mass, right? In this colloidal system, certainly no particles are being born or dying, right? And in many cases that we're interested in, even in biological systems which can reproduce, the flow phenomena that we're interested in on a time scales that are much shorter than the reproduction time scale, right? So we don't really care about the fact that the conservation number isn't conserved in a strict sense. But sometimes we do care, right? And there are certainly models where instead of being a mass-conserving system, we think about a system with lots of reproduction and death. And the second equation, which is the Navier-Stokes equation, in equilibrium, and this, what are called the Toner 2 equations in out of equilibrium, is a vector equation. So it now has an equation for each component of the velocity. In lots of cases, we'll have two-dimensional flows or two-dimensional velocity fields. But in principle, it could be three-dimensional as well. And the Navier-Stokes equation, right, which comes from momentum conservation, has a similar form, and we can now compare and contrast them, right? What's similar here? One thing that's very obviously different, right, is the variable that I used, right? Here, for equilibrium fluids, I used V for flow, right? Whereas for the polar active fluid, the polar order parameter is not in principle, is not a velocity at all. It's instead the alignment parameter for these particles, and I'll get to how to define it more precisely. It just so happens that what's special about these fluids is that they flow along this alignment parameter. Yeah, please. Oh, yeah.
So I've heard some critiques of this picture which basically sum up that most active systems, like say, direction of propulsion is not actually the direction of the velocity, right? You can want to go this way but drift this way. Does this change the equations you've written here in some fundamental way, or is it captured in this hydrodynamic picture?
No, it's a very good point. So, as I said, this is a particular minimal model, right? And so it ignores that effect very explicitly. So you could have both a velocity equation and a polarization equation with some propensity to align or some preference for aligning. But that introduces extra degrees of freedom. I think for every example that I give in both fluids and solids cases, there will be, I'll probably give the simplest kind of most basic model, and there will be always kind of layers you can build on top to include other degrees of freedom, depending on the phenomena that you want to describe. So this has polarization, but for example, not this kind of misalignment that you mentioned.
Thank you.
Okay, So then the other important difference here that I really wanted to emphasize is this term, which has all the other terms, and we could come back to them, have kind of analogs in the Navier-Stokes equations, right? But this one doesn't. And so this is somehow the active term here. And what I'll tell you about in just a bit is how this leads to a net polarization, right? A non-zero polarization, which when you kind of make the equivalence between velocity and polarization, right? Say that the polarization is the velocity, gives you this spontaneous flow of the active fluid, right? So this is really the important term for activity. But the other terms are perhaps more intuitive, right? This term here in the Navier-Stokes equation is mass times acceleration, right? This is Newton's second law written in this form. And here you have the derivative of velocity. Here you have a derivative of the polarization instead. This second term, right, is also part of the kind of convective derivative in the Navier-Stokes equation, has a slightly different role in these active polar fluids, where you see that this is prefactor lambda, right? They could in principle be arbitrary, and if you measure it in lots of polar active systems, it'll be of the order of 1, but often slightly less than 1. Right? And the fact that it's not exactly equal to 1, 0.8 or 0.6 are some of the examples, is important because it tells you about a particular symmetry that this Navier-Stokes equation has that the active polar fluid does not have, and that's the symmetry of Galilean invariance. Right? In the Navier-Stokes equation, you can look at it in a different reference frame, right? You could be moving relative to the fluid. There's no special reference frame from the fluid perspective. And so you can transform all of your equations into this co-moving frame, and they will look the same. But in the active polar fluid case, in the particular the Toner 2 model, what's special here is that these colloids, right, in all of these systems, necessarily rely on a substrate, right? They go, or sometimes it's a fluid through which the particles swim, but in any case, there's a particular rest frame for this fluid, right, through which the particles are moving. And did my mic go up? Yeah.
It's fine.
So what's special about that frame, right, the frame that of the substrate here is that if you try to transform, into a different frame, then the substrate will be moving with a velocity, right? And so you don't expect your equations of motion will be invariant to that frame transformation, and that's what causes these parameters lambda. There are other terms you can write that also break this Galilean invariance that are absent in the Navier-Stokes case. And finally, these last two terms are perhaps the most intuitive ones. This is a term due to viscous stresses. And you have a similar thing here. These are viscous stresses now due to the strain rate gradients, right, within the colloidal system, right? If the particles are moving relative to each other with some velocity, they will experience a stress. And the final bit is a pressure term, right? A gradient of a pressure. Of course, again, this is kind of an active pressure or a pressure due to the colloidal particles. You could imagine measuring it when they hit a wall, but it doesn't have the same relation to thermodynamic pressure that we would have in equilibrium, right? That we have in the Navier-Stokes equations, because of course we're not in thermodynamic equilibrium. Yeah, please.
A very quick question about this extra term, this A2 minus A4.
Yeah.
It kind of looks like what you would get from the minimization of a Landau free energy. Is that what it is?
Yeah, it is what that's exactly what it is. I'll promise I'll get to it in a couple of slides. That's the only term I haven't covered yet. So yeah.
Is it obvious that there's an obvious way to see that if you do something in the first equation, you recover that, meaning that exactly the term that we are talking now is a way that when it's really clear or obvious that one recovers? What is the limit?
Yeah, I think it's a fairly simple limit. So you want to get rid of this term, right? A2 is equal to A4 is equal to 0. Then you want to set lambda is equal to 1. And then other than this is just a matter of renaming the parameters, right? In this very simple model, right? This recovers the Navier-Stokes equation. This recovers Galilean invariance. This tells you that there's no activity propelling the particles.
Okay, so that's when only when you kill completely the activity, then you recover. That's the obvious limit.
Yeah. So you could have, for example, cases where you have a fluid flowing on a substrate, but it's still an equilibrium fluid, right? Then you could still have an A2 term. A2 kind of looks like friction, right? It would be like A2V here. But in particular, this A2 would have to be negative by equilibrium laws, whereas here it can be either sign and can be positive, which is the more interesting case.
What is lambda physically?
So where's lambda here, right? Lambda is the prefactor of this convective derivative term, right? And
but what does it mean physically?
So essentially, well, the way that I think about it is this kind of how far have you broken Galilean invariance, right? And how important is this presence of a reference frame from the point of view of the fluid? It's a trickier, because it's a nonlinear term, it's a trickier one to interpret in terms of, particle interactions. All right, just to remind you, right? So this is exactly the video that I showed in the beginning, where you have the spontaneous flow, and it comes about, it can be described, at least in general, as a minimal model from these equations, right? So to kind of get back to describing these equations, one crucial kind of feature here is this parameter P, right, that isn't present anywhere in the Navier-Stokes equations. And the way to think about it is that when you have these polar active particles, they necessarily have a particular direction, right? This polarity that tells you in which way do they propel, right? Which direction are they propelling into, right? And if you have equal number of particles, in the simplest 1D case, propelling in to the right as to the left, right? You will have no net flow, right? You'll still have something interesting and non-equilibrium. We can kind of get to it, but it won't have a vector order parameter that you can define to understand it. Instead, the vector order parameter comes from an average of these directions of individual particles, right, averaged over some sort of patch of space, right? And this is a procedure that's very much like, the coarse graining of spin models, right? You can think of this as effectively a, self-propelled spin model, or coarse graining of, particles to get the Navier-Stokes equation, to get the hydrodynamic equations. So in that sense, the polarization is an order parameter, right? It tells you the degree of alignment between the particles, but it also tells you the velocity, because each particle, the velocity is just v naught times p, right? Each particle has this self-propulsion associated with their direction. All right, and so now, kind of going back to rewriting these equations with this interpretation, right? We can think of this equation rather than an equation for momentum conservation, which it sort of looks like, except for this term, right? This term does not conserve momentum. We can instead reinterpret it as an equation for the relaxation of an order parameter, right? Where P is now this local orientation of the particles. It happens to be proportional to V. But this equation just tells you that in the steady state, P will have some preferred value, right? And if it deviates from that preferred value, it tells you the slow evolution of these degrees of freedom towards that. In particular, you can see that if I say, well, I'm going to have no derivatives, right? I'm going to have something that's steady state, and uniform in space. So I kill the time derivative here, kill all the spatial derivatives. The only equation that I'm left with is this one, right? A2 minus A4. P squared is equal to 0, right? If P is non-zero, right? Or P is 0. So if P is not equal to 0, then you can have this other solution. Only in the case that A2 is positive, right? You'll get a real solution that's given by this expression, the square root of A2 over A4. And one kind of justification for it, where it comes from, is by analogy with this kind of Landau theory for what a relaxation of an order parameter equation could look like. So this is an equation. It's probably one of the simplest equations for this kind of spontaneous symmetry breaking when we're looking at an active system, right? Where you have the emergence of this order parameter away from 0 once you have a sufficiently strong active term. Really, you can interpret this A2 as being the crucial active term here, because it needs to be positive, and then A4 you can kind of interpret it as a regularization term that prevents P from running off to infinity. All right, so this is kind of the symmetry-based arguments, and most of what I'll tell you about actually relies on symmetry-based arguments, right? That's an argument that I really like, and that was how these equations, or their generalization, were written down originally by Toner and Tu back in 1995. That's probably one of the first works of active matter physics. But there are other ways to try to understand these equations and to derive them, in particular to connect them with other ideas, right? The idea is that, for example, what if your velocity and polarization are not aligned, are a little bit out of alignment? And what if you have a particular microscopic model that's really has spins interacting with some particular way, right? How do you find all of the parameters in these Toner-2 equations, right? So this three approach is very impressive, but also very difficult, right? So if you take a particular model that that's amenable to, this is a particularly simple model of particle interactions, is particularly amenable to coarse graining, you can derive a version of these equations, of these Toner-2 equations. It has some extra terms because they're allowed based on symmetries, but the point is that it certainly has all the terms that I've mentioned, and there are explicit expressions that relate the particle interactions and things like particle self-propulsion to these hydrodynamic parameters, right? These coarse grain parameters. So I think this is a very impressive work. From kind of the symmetry-based argument downside, the sort of the upside of it is, of course, it's concrete, right? This isn't you could say, oh, you've just guessed the Toner-2 equations, maybe you've gotten them wrong, right? What if you forgot some symmetry-based term? Here, you know what all the terms are. There aren't any other ones that appear. But the downside is that if you take a more complicated model, and in particular if you're trying to think about living systems and so on, or even the colloids, which have both these electric and hydrodynamic interactions, you might wonder, well, how does that change all of this, all of these parameters, right? At what point do you need to have a completely different description, for example, right? And the symmetry-based argument sort of gives you, tells you that within this set of systems, you'll always be of the Toner-2 universality class, right? So in particular that in these simple experimental systems, it's often that these parameters are instead measured, right, rather than being derived from some sort of microscopic models, which are the sort of the exception. And sort of the other kind of argument that I wanted to give you, which is maybe closer to the equilibrium argument, is to kind of go back to this idea, well, what if the particles don't align perfectly with the velocity, right, where there's some mismatch? Particularly the way I'm going to introduce this mismatch is through reintroducing inertia, right, and having both relaxation order parameter, right, the relaxation of an order parameter to its steady state, and the inertial equations all in one, right? So I'm going to rewrite the Navier-Stokes equation in this slightly different way, where everything that's under a gradient I just put into this stress tensor term. Then what you could do is you could say, well, I have an equilibrium fluid, but I'm going to say that, well, each particle has a polar degree of freedom, and that this polar, now macroscopic polar order, has its own equation of evolution, right? So this is a polar liquid. It's not an active liquid in any way, but this polar order parameter now has its own relaxation dynamics, right? And this is allowed. Lots of fluids really do have polar order. But the question is, how do you then connect it to the active case? And of course, you can kind of have the same symmetry-based argument saying that, well, if I make this fluid active while still keeping it inertial, I'm going to have extra terms that connect this momentum conservation equation, the Navier-Stokes equation, and the polarization and relaxation equation, right? And some of the terms that you can have involve, for example, a preference, right, for the velocity to be the same as the polarization, and the sort of relaxation of the polarization to a certain value based on the velocity. Okay, so I've just now made things a lot more complicated than where I started out with. But what you can do now is to say, well, what if this term dominates, right? So this is taking the kind of over-damped limit or the non-inertial limit in a more systematic way, where I'm saying, I'll start with having both the velocity of polarization, but I'm going to go into the limit where this equation, right, when this term is much larger than all of the other terms, just tells you that the velocity and the polarization will be aligned, right? And once you do that, you can kind of substitute that back in and get a version of these Toner 2 equations away from this. And again, this kind of relaxation dynamic, this Landau term, comes precisely from the relaxation dynamics in your polar order parameter in equilibrium. So there's sort of a third argument. It doesn't really give you much more than hydrodynamics to begin with, but it tells you a little bit why a purely a relaxation dynamics equation can be reminiscent of inertial dynamics, right? So what I mean is that here, right, the polarization looks like a mass times acceleration term, right, which is this one, but it doesn't come from that. Doesn't come from that origin at all. It's just sort of a coincidence or a really interesting physical observation. All right. So one term. Yeah, please.
Just to understand that this just means that you, as soon as you have polarization, you are overdamped in the sense that your velocity always aligns that.
Exactly.
Okay. So there is the torque has an instantaneous alignment to that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly the limit in which you can write these Toner 2 equations. All right. So, oh yeah, please.
In the complex equations from the last slide.
Yeah.
What differentiates it from elasticity equations? Because we have these rotation terms.
These ones, you mean? Sorry, which one?
What's the difference with the elasticity equation?
So here, the main difference here from hydrodynamics and elasticity, I promise I'll get to it in more details in the next lecture when I really focus on elasticity more so. But the fact that velocity is our kind of relevant degree of freedom rather than displacement, right, is what gives you hydrodynamics. And the reason for that is that, in a solid, you have a reference state against which it makes sense to measure displacement and to say that this particle has gone this way relative to where it wants to be. Whereas in a fluid, any position of a single particle is kind of equally preferred, right? It doesn't matter. What matters is actually how the particles move, the velocity that they move against each other.
Maybe I'm confused, but if you move, we assume that we have a constant velocity. So if we move with the frame of reference, it's kind of like a elasticity problem, or not?
Well, it's still different because you have this, at least in the Navier-Stokes equation, this Galilean invariance, right, where if you actually move with a certain constant velocity everywhere, the equation doesn't change at all, right? So any reference frame is equivalent, which again for a solid, it's not.
Because I was thinking of making like stresses in the fluid, so maybe we can like switch to elasticity, but no, I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean one kind of interesting mix of elasticity and fluid dynamics that I'll only touch upon in these lectures is viscoelasticity, right? Where you can have simultaneously both elastic and fluid phenomena in the same material, where usually what happens is that short time scales pretty much, well, every material is viscoelastic on some sort of a time scale, right? It's just that time scale tends to be, very short for kind of normal solids, right? If you instead, in viscoelastic materials, what happens is that you have some sort of elastic components, let's say springs, right, that have, given enough time, will eventually relax. But if you have continuous fluid flow, you never give them the time to relax, and there's this interplay. All right. So I wanted to give these kind of as examples that I'll come back to for how hydrodynamic continuum equations for active matter tend to arise, right? I would say that most of the time we'll talk about the kind of symmetry-based approaches, but the other ones are worth keeping in mind as well. The other kind of term that has come up a lot here and that will come up again and again is inertia, right? And or vice versa, the overdamped limit, right, which just means the limit that the inertia isn't present. And of course, in equilibrium dynamics, there's a very well-known parameter that quantifies the effect of the inertia, which is the Reynolds number. It's sort of the relative effect of inertia and viscosity for a fluid, right? In fact, it's sort of the only, in some sense, the only dimensionless parameter in this Navier-Stokes equations. In active matter, often, we can't reduce everything down to just one number, one Reynolds number, right, to understand whether inertia is important. In most cases that I'll tell you about, I just really like this video, so I wanted to show this to you. This is sort of an active matter system, so it's not entirely irrelevant. But here you're sort of seeing the effect of inertia on a biological organism and biological function. And so there is something called, this paper is on what's called hydrodynamic starvation, right? Which it turns out that when fish are growing, if they start out small enough, they have a very hard time eating. And the reason for that is that fluid dynamics without inertia, right, which is fluid dynamics at very small length scales, is purely reversible, right? So if you open your mouth and ingest the food, when you close your mouth, the food will flow out. And this is exactly what's happening in this video here. You see the piece of food going out, and it going in, and then it goes out. And so this is actually a real problem for many organisms. They starve to death because they can't eat at very small scales, and they have to come up with all sorts of methods for overcoming this a low Reynolds number flow. All right, but yeah. I'm not a biologist, you know, yeah. They have, yeah, I think they do have some solutions. I mean, one thing that, of course, you know, inertia is never truly zero, right? And in lots of cases, even a little bit of inertia can go a long way, right? And so there's this kind of really interesting phase diagram you could make for organisms, right? If you think about, you know, active matter in swimmer systems in particular, right? Where, you know, when you can ask, when does inertia actually matter, right? And, you know, to some degree, in this, in the case of the low Reynolds number, and this is now, by the way, the Reynolds number for the surrounding fluid, right? For, you know, the actual Navier-Stokes equations. When the Reynolds number is small enough, you can probably truly neglect inertia, right? But once you start going to even, you know, Reynolds numbers that are still small, or you think that they're a pretty good perturbation parameter, but not quite zero, inertia starts to play a role, and especially when you think about the collections of many different organisms, you know, sort of for one length scale, that the inertia might be completely negligible, but when you look at a larger length scales, you know, the larger the length scale, the more relevant the inertia, it could kind of become more and more important, right? So this is all to say that inertia is difficult, right? And the overdamped equation, in many cases, we write them out because we can understand them, whereas at intermediate and high Reynolds numbers, when we're dealing with mesoscopic or macroscopic organisms, let's say the role of inertia in active flow is still poorly understood. There's certainly lots of interesting phenomena there. Another kind of classification that we can think of, you know, inertial, non-inertial, another classification for active systems that's similar, right? And equilibrium would be probably the same thing as inertia, but here slightly more subtle, is the idea of momentum conservation, right? So in the case, and this is, you know, one way to think about this is the difference between a herd of animals on a, you know, on Earth, on a field, and fish swimming through water, right? Because in a case of a herd of animals, right, there's, you know, if an animal stops, there's a little bit of inertia, but it can stop fairly quickly, right? And, you know, the herd length scales, that probably doesn't matter too much. And, you know, I guess it still displaces some sort of a fluid, some sort of air, but the air flow isn't so important, right? Instead, the momentum for the, you know, propulsion of the herd, the self-propulsion of the herd, comes from the Earth, right? It pushes off the Earth, and it can use that Earth to stop, right, very quickly as well. So it can use it as a sink of momentum as well. But fish swimming in water, and that's even more the case that, you know, with lots of other swimmers, they necessarily swim by expelling fluid the other way, right? So there's no way to kind of take into account for fish stopping or starting to swim without taking into account the water that's going the other way, right? And so there's this extra conserved quantity that comes in, which is momentum conservation, which people have perhaps, you know, controversially started calling these active systems with momentum conservation as wet active matter, right? Wet in the sense that you really have to take the fluid into account to try to understand it, whereas dry, you know, can still be in water, right? But like the colloidal particles. So the Quincke rollers is an example of a dry active matter system, right? It's polar here. So this is a table where these are different symmetries. I'll get to what a pneumatic active fluid is in just a second. But the Quincke roller case, this colloidal polar active fluid, is both dry and polar here. There are lots of other examples, you know, biological, animal herds is an example here as well. But it's still in water, right? It's not that it's dry in the kind of normal sense. It's just that the water flow isn't so important. It has, you know, some effect in terms of the details of the interactions between the particles, but the macroscale phenomena would still be the same, even if the effect of water was turned off artificially. So even within this kind of active, polar active fluid class, you have different subclassifications that are important to consider when you think about which equations of motion to write, and in particular the Toner 2 equations are the dry polar active matter equation, right? They're the kind of simplest dry polar active matter model. If you need to take water into account, you need to have extra equations that describe flow. There is a system that's in some sense simpler than the Toner 2 equations, right? And that's a system that's still active, right? But without any breaking of spatial symmetries at all, right? So in other words, you take the same kind of system of self-propelled particles, but you just say they're not going to align, right? So you have self-propulsion here, but for some reasons, and this happens a lot, there isn't a preference for the particles to be aligned versus anti-aligned versus at some angle. And what's clear here is that the system is still out of equilibrium, and it's often called scalar active matter. What's less kind of clear, and perhaps still an open question, is exactly what happens in the system, what sort of phases you can have. What you can do is you can rewrite the equation. Of course, now we don't have a velocity, so you'd say, well, what equation do we have left now? We just have the continuity equation. We still have conservation of particle number. But now this continuity equation, which in equilibrium would just be the diffusion equation, can have these strange dependencies on the density and the velocity locally of the fluid. And in particular, one thing that can happen is that this this is the same equation. This velocity dependence on the density can result in what's called motility-induced phase separation here, where if your particles slow each other down, right? If you had higher densities, you have a lower effective velocity for a system, which often happens, right? You just kind of go into a crowded room and suddenly you can't walk as fast, right? That's exactly this, this effect. What happens then is that you could have phase coexistence in this system between kind of denser phase, right, where the particles have slowed down, and a gaseous phase where they're dilute and fast. And the special thing here, of course, phase coexistence is quite common in all sorts of fluids, but the special thing here for scalar active matter is that you can put in particles that have purely repulsive interaction, let's say just hardcore repulsive spheres, and still observe this phase separation. So just from the effect of this crowding of the particles, you can make a dense phase without having to condense due to short-range attraction, the way that it happens in normal fluids. All right, and then I wanted to go through kind of the last example of, well, no, actually, this is the second to last example of active fluids. That's, but this one is perhaps the most complicated one, which is the active pneumatic fluid. This was the example that I showed you in the beginning with the pattern-forming system, just to remind you of this one. You can kind of imagine that to try to understand what's going on here, you need something fairly complex. So what's happening here, what's different between the flow in this fluid of filaments and motors and the colloidal, the polar active fluid case, is the fact that there isn't a polar preference for these motors to self-propel. Instead, the activity, the effective activity here is within, a you can think of it as affecting the interaction between two of the rods, two of the filaments in the system, where a motor kind of connects to both filaments and then walks on both filaments at the same time, which means that it sort of shears the system, right? This filament will go, let's say, this way, and this filament will go this way. And so in practice, these motors connect and disconnect over and over, but the net effect is that there is an active stress, right? There's an active effect here where the particles are pushed on each other, but there isn't a polar order, right? There isn't a preference for this whole thing to go in one direction. And that's, that's where this pneumatic symmetry comes from, right? So we can understand this pneumatic order parameter now in terms of the alignment between these filamentous-like particles, right? The extended particles here. But now the direction of, forward and backwards for this particle is the same, right? So there isn't a preference for this particle to go this way versus this way, just that it won't go in any other direction. And you can try to then model at the level of particle this the effect of the motors as a force dipole, right? What I mean is really there's one force here and an equal and opposite force here, so there's no net force, but there's a force dipole that that's related to the degree of local alignment here, which is captured in this pneumatic order parameter, and the kind of degree of activity. In other words, the number of motors is the amount of fuel that you have, right? So one thing you kind of might ask is where this order parameter comes from, right? This Q tensor, and this is the same order parameter that's used to describe equilibrium pneumatics as these active pneumatics. One way to think about it, one way to think about where it comes from is the fact that if you don't have a preference for going this way versus this way, there isn't an order parameter that you can write out that just has an odd number of these vectors nu in it. Instead, you need an even number, and kind of the lowest even number you can have is 2. So what this order parameter tells you is that you can take an outer product of these two vectors, right? This is the I here is the index of the particle, not the index of the vector, and make a matrix out of it, right? And in particular, the way that it's written out here, this is going to be a symmetric traceless tensor, symmetric traceless matrix, which in 2 dimensions. By the way, for the experts, I won't try to think about biaxial pneumatics. So in 2 dimensions, you can find a coordinate frame where this matrix looks like this, and in 3 dimensions, it'll be something like this. And once you diagonalize it, right? This is symmetric, traceless, and it has this one number, S, that tells you the degree of alignment, right? This is sort of the magnitude of it. Since this Q tensor, right, is traceless, then trace of Q is not a good way to try to take an absolute value. Instead, what you want to do is take the trace of Q squared, and this will be proportional to S squared. So in both of these cases. So this is a kind of a way to quantify, right? A matrix isn't a good way to say, do I have lots of order or very little order? But S will tell you, if it's 0, there's no order. If it's 1, well, that's kind of maximal. Oh, this is a little bit more of the explanation, actually, of this force dipole mechanism. So people can actually see this happening, right? Where you experimentally, you take two of these filaments, you can, so what's special about them, what I didn't tell you about, is the fact that these filaments have, beginning and an end, right? They have this red end and this blue end, and they're different from each other. And when they come together, when they align, what happens is that the blue ends are pushed out from each other, right? And when they align this way, right, there's the, when they, so that's in this first part of the picture, you can see the pushing out of the blue ends, but then when they stick this way, there's no net action of the molecular motors, right? All right, so to a good approximation in lots of these polar active systems, the, oh, and this is just to say that when you go from a single filament to lots of them, right? In the other video I showed, there's lots going on, including density variations, but you can make a fairly uniform density active pneumatic here, and you can see complex flows where you can kind of trace what the order parameter is doing in each direction, right, which way the filaments are aligned, but then the dynamics for predicting these filaments is quite hard, quite complicated. So it turns out that when you coarse grain from a particle-based picture to a large-scale picture, there's one particular term that you can introduce that's lower order than any term that's allowed in equilibrium that captures the effective activity in a very in a very faithful way, right? You reproduce a lot of the same phenomena just by including this term. And yeah, oh yeah, 1 minute. Oh, I see. Okay. So you have the, you capture the effective activity here, and then all you do is you take the same equations of motion as for the fluid equilibrium pneumatics and add this extra term, and you reproduce a lot of the effects that you see in active systems. So I think I'll stop here, and I'll continue tomorrow with the rest of the lectures.
Thank you so much, Anton. Very, very nice, very interesting. We have time for one quick question only, if there is. Mathieu.
Thanks, very interesting. It's more a methodological question. You showed some beautiful soft matter experiments, and we need those experiments because when we do theory, we're always surprised, we're missing, and also for technology. But I was wondering for the robotic experiments. In some sense, the theorist himself is putting all the ingredients. So are there examples where you get surprised?
I hope to convince
you could simulate,
yeah.
because otherwise you could...
Yeah. Well, I would say that, yeah, you can simulate the robots pretty well. Although I guess you could also, in practice, simulate, a lot of the other experimental systems as well. But yeah, in simulations, I guess you also get surprises as well, is what I mean, right? Yeah. I see. So that's a very, very good question. I would say that, there are some surprises. I would say that, in simulations, you always have to ask how many, which details of the robot do I get to keep? And I think that, for example, if you only keep the linear response, then you do get surprised when you go to nonlinear order, and that sort of will be maybe one of the things I wanted to show you, the kind of interesting nonlinear phenomena you get that you don't program in any sense.
Okay, let's thank Anton again. Don't
about
forget
the photo, right?
There is the photo, yeah. And there is you have to put your name here, okay? Yeah. During the day, yeah.